Hello, and welcome to Moms Fighting Autism. I'm your moderator for this evening, Chantal Sicile-Kira. I'm an author, an advocate, and a speaker on autism spectrum disorders with over 20 years of experience. Plus, I'm a parent of Jeremy, who some of you may know from MTV's True Life, I Have Autism. I've written a few books. The most recent one is Autism Life Skills, From Communication and Safety to Self-Esteem and More. 10 essential abilities every child on the spectrum deserves and needs to learn. And for this book, I interviewed many people on the autism spectrum, including our guest this evening, who is Brian R. King. Brian is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in Naperville, Illinois, and he brings a unique threefold perspective to the world of Asperger's. Not only does he have two sons on the autism spectrum and a practice focusing exclusively on working with Asperger clients and their families, Brian himself is also blessed with Asperger's. Brian has become known worldwide for his positive approach to living the Asperger's experience, and he is dedicating his time to serving as an ambassador between the Asperger and neurotypical communities. His goal is to help both communities learn to better communicate, appreciate, and cooperate with each other in a spirit of mutual respect. Brian is also the author of a few books, and I'm going to let him speak to you about them. But I want to say that when I was asked who should be on this show to talk about Asperger's, my first thought was Brian. And so I'd like to introduce Brian. And Brian, could you speak a little bit about your books and your work?
Well, certainly. I actually have 3 books. The first one I wrote was about 10 years ago, prior to my even knowing that there was such a thing as Asperger's or that it even applied to me, because I'm also a 20-year cancer survivor. And the first book I wrote was about my real logical approach to enduring a very rough time in my life. And there's clearly a lot of Aspergian thinking in that book. And the title of that one is a little shocking, so cover your ears. It's What to Do When You're Totally Screwed. That's the name of the first book. And that basically addresses that feeling of hopelessness that sometimes hits you when you undergo a crisis in life. And I basically just highlighted my story as well as my strategies for overcoming that sense of hopelessness. And the 2 that I just recently released within the past month or so are Asperger's related. The first one is called I'm an Aspie, which is also the domain name to my website. And the reason I call it that is because I wear my Asperger's as a sign of courage, not as a disorder, disability, or anything to be ashamed of. It's part of who I am. So I self-identify as an Aspie. And what that book is comprised of is a lot of very solution-focused poetry, because poetry is the writing style I'm most comfortable with. And instead of just reflecting on life and having a lot of flowery language, I decided to make it much more focused on solutions and strategies, just in poetry form. And as you mentioned before, my reputation for being positive, it's all very much driven on how to take control of your life, how to be responsible, and how to take ownership of your Asperger's in your life in a very empowered way so you can actually become who you want to be. And the third book is a children's book. It's called Thank You, Sammy, and it's about a squirrel that has Asperger's and is the quirkiest member of the forest. And just by virtue of doing what logically makes sense to him to do, he endears himself to his fellow forest creatures, and they come to appreciate him for exactly who he is.
Well, that sounds really interesting. Both of them sound like good examples of books that people who have children with Asperger's should read, because even the first one, I'm an Aspie, if you're a parent and you're not someone with Asperger's syndrome, it kind of helps to explain what it's like looking through the eyes of someone with Asperger's. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were diagnosed with Asperger's as an adult?
Well, I like to say that I was certified, because diagnosis is something you get when you're sick, and I don't like to think of it as something that's wrong with me. I'm certified. It's like somebody would be certified in any other accomplishment in life. But I received my certification at the age of 35, and that came about through my then 7-year-old son, Zachary, my oldest boy, who upon entering first grade started exhibiting a lot of social anxiety, difficulty maintaining focus, would panic if there were sudden changes in his schedule. And that's when the school staff brought these things to mine and my then wife's attention, and we began exploring what might be going on with him, and that's when we were introduced to the term Asperger's.
Interesting. And how did you recognize yourself as perhaps being someone who should receive the certification of having Asperger's?
Well, I was the one, I'm a social worker by profession, and so I was the one who followed him to the various diagnostic appointments. I took him to the pediatrician, I took him to the clinical psychologist, took him to the occupational therapist, and in the process of filling out the various questionnaires, the history, it was the occupational therapist eval that really hit me because it was asking about a lot of sensory sensitivities, difficulties with light and sound and touch and motion. And I was seeing all these red flags, not only for my present life, but my younger life as a school child. And I literally started hyperventilating, saying, oh, my goodness, this is me. This describes me. And I asked the OT for another version of the test because I wanted to fill one out for me as well as my son. And it was just staring me right in the face. I never realized that the way I had been experiencing life and sound and smell and touch was unique to me and wasn't shared by the majority of the population.
So you actually discovered the fact that you may have Asperger's through first discovering about sensory integration and sensory processing difficulties.
Right.
Or challenges. Yeah, and I did mention this because when I interviewed many adults for my Autism Life Skills book, I'm very cognizant of the fact that many children on the, let's say, the more impacted end of the spectrum, such as my son Jeremy, are very impacted by sensory integration or sensory processing difficulties. But I didn't realize how much many people with Asperger's also experience some of those problems, but yet they're much more able to compensate by the fact that they have Asperger's rather than autism in the way that my son does. And so just learning and listening and reading so much about what Brian had to share in his books and on his website and in talking with him made me understand so much more that my son, who is nonverbal, I mean, he has a way to communicate, but unless you know the right questions, you don't always get the right answers. And so I learned so much about what my son could be feeling and going through, which helped me in making life a little bit easier for him in terms of some of those sensory difficulties that he has. I don't know if you wanted to comment a little bit about some of your things that you discovered about the environment and how to approach it in the areas that you have difficulties with.
Well, that's a big can of worms. I'm not even sure where to begin. What I basically discovered is that I have sensitivities in all of my senses. And some people on the spectrum will experience it in one more so than the other. They'll have a greater sensitivity to light or to touch or even to sound, but I have sensitivities in all of them. So when I was a young child, I would have almost daily meltdowns, either at school or just coming home from school. I would beg my mother, don't send me back there, because it was just too overwhelming a place for me to be. And on holidays, when all the family would come over, there'd be the clanking plates and all the chatter and everybody wanting to hug you and kiss you. And it was usually within the first 20 minutes to half an hour that I was having a meltdown or be sent to my room for making a scene. So it's the auditory sensitivities, usually high pitches or low tones. Sometimes it actually is experienced by me as physical pain. So when other kids on the spectrum are sensitive to sound, a neurotypical adult would say, well, just ignore it, it'll be over soon. Don't worry about it. Well, that's like saying, okay, I'm going to poke you in the leg with this knife, but just ignore it, because I'll only be doing it for the next few seconds. Because they don't realize how powerfully it's being experienced by the child or even the young adult's body. And when it comes to motion, I realize that for my entire life I've been looking at the ground when I walk, because my eyes and my middle ear, which is responsible for balance, don't communicate very effectively with each other. So I need to look at something that doesn't move, which is typically the ground. That's the only way I can feel steady. If I look up when I walk, I start to feel sick to my stomach and disoriented and get a little dizzy until I look at the ground again. So that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right, but it's very eye-opening for those of us who don't experience what that feels like, to have someone who is as eloquent as you are in discussing to be able to describe some of those things. Now, we have a lot of really interesting questions that people have sent in, and before we get started on those, I wanted to ask you, is there anything in particular you wanted to share about your practice as a clinical social worker?
Well, I think the main thing about it is whenever somebody comes to my office, they typically say, I'm the first person who did not give them a doom and gloom scenario in terms of the future of their child. Because it is my opinion that the only thing that results in disability in life is the denial of access. I mean, when you look at people who are in wheelchairs, they are disabled only in so much as they can't gain access to the things in life they want. In the absence of ramps and elevators and whatnot, they are limited in their access to other things. Put those things in place, and all of a sudden they can participate. With people on the spectrum, if they're nonverbal, give them communication tools. You know, if they have sensory sensitivities, help find ways to help them compensate so they can engage more noisy places, brighter places. Let them wear sunglasses in the store. That, you know, break down those barriers to allow them access to a greater life, as opposed to saying, you need to change. So I guess I'm much more creative in my thinking in terms of where the solutions lie, as opposed to, we need to change this child and make them more like everybody else, otherwise they're not going to succeed. I realize we've got to be more creative than that, and we've also got to respect the individual and say, well, let's take this person as far as they can go within the parameters of their strengths and challenges, but hey, you, the rest of society, you got to give a little bit too. We got to work together here.
Right. And I really appreciate your positive experience and your positive way of dealing with things. For example, you wrote an article called The R Word, which was printed in a magazine called The Autism File, which is a magazine on autism that's available in many Barnes & Nobles, but not all of them. And so did you want to talk a little bit about this article, and then I'm going to ask you some of these questions.
Oh, sure. Well, the R Word, it stemmed from a real-life experience. My oldest boy, Zach, is very, very friendly, very loving, but he can also be very overwhelming because when he wants to talk, he will talk incessantly about his interests, and he's not always aware of when other people are not interested in what he wants to talk about. And he can come on very strong. And he's, of course, like any other Aspie, he's very eccentric and very delightfully quirky in his own way. And the other kids don't really get him sometimes. And it came to my attention that there was a neighborhood bully that one day referred to him as a retard because of how he was acting. And that is the R word. And in the special needs community, calling somebody a retard is the equivalent of using the N word in the African American community. So as soon as I heard that, I knew I needed to do something. Well, my being, a little averse to socialization myself, I really didn't know my neighbors that well. I'm not one to wave and, be a joiner. That's just not my thing, but I knew I had to address that. So what I decided to do was write the neighborhood a letter. So I sat down and basically introduced myself, apologized for not, being more friendly and reaching out. I basically introduced Zachary to them, explained what Asperger's was and how it contributed to his eccentric behavior, and I made a particular point to empathize with the other neighborhood parents and their children in not knowing how to deal with him sometimes when he comes on strong. So I wasn't blaming anybody for the mistreatment of Zachary. I was empathizing, and then I offered my support in helping them support Zachary so that he could be included in their lives. So I offered myself as a resource. And also, most importantly, making myself part of the solution. Saying, we are a community, we live in the same neighborhood, our kids are going to play together. Let's communicate so that they can understand each other and therefore be more respectful of each other. Because I I could very easily have said that this retard word came from this mean, child that was obviously raised poorly. I could have gone from that standpoint, but there's no solution in that. There's just anger. I needed to get some kind of resolution so my child could be accepted in the neighborhood. And when I sent that letter around the neighborhood, parents came over and were shaking my hand and said, "Oh, thank you so much for writing this. I was feeling so bad because I didn't know what to do for him, and I'm glad you validated my concerns because you're right. He could be so frustrating, and I didn't know what to do." And I sympathized with them and saying, "Well, I'm glad that you accepted this with open arms," and they were grateful for the explanation. Explaining why does this child act so differently from my child? I guess I was fortunate in that I had a few enlightened neighbors. Not every neighborhood is going to be that fortunate, but I was lucky in that respect where they were grateful for the information, and they ended up not only embracing my son, but they invited me over, and they wanted to ask me more questions about Asperger's. And in some ways, they began, through me, saying, "Oh, well, you know what, my little nephew acts a little bit like that," or, "You know what, my older brother's a little bit like that too." So it went far beyond my getting support from my son and ended up kind of helping them in their own lives.
I recently interviewed Michael J. Carley, who is the executive director of GRASP, on my radio show, and it was interesting because he said that he felt that his son was very lucky to have his father who has Asperger's, because his father who has Asperger's understands the Asperger part of his son and knows how to help him, how to bring out his strengths to help him with the areas that he has more difficulty with. And also he understands more clearly how to educate the people around, as the example that you have shows, because you feel it, you understand what your son's going through, and you understand how the people on the other side don't get it.
Oh, absolutely. And what's more importantly is if you're able to understand why the other side doesn't get it.
Right.
Because and it's difficult to explain how I'm able to do that, because there is some difficulty with people on the spectrum in terms of perspective taking and seeing other people's point of views. And actually, just in talking about it, I think I do understand how I get at that. One of my skills, which of course lends itself to my career, is I'm able to understand people's logic, their thought patterns, how they construct their thinking in the same way maybe somebody who's very gifted at math can just whip through an equation and solve it very easily. I'm able to decode people's thinking the same way. So when I hear anybody, whether it be on the spectrum or neurotypical, talk about certain things, I'm able to break down their logic and figure out how they got there. So I can say, okay, well, you're thinking this way and you're putting your thoughts together in this order, and that's why you've drawn that conclusion. Let me reframe it or tweak it a little bit so you can see my perspective. And that's kind of how I'm able to be an ambassador of sorts and help the two sides talk to each other.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the fact that you're there, Brian, seriously. It's such a great resource in the community to have someone like you who can be that ambassador between the communities as such. So now you ready to start with some questions?
Certainly.
Okay, so this one's from Mike Tumlin in Birmingham. Hi, Brian. I am the father of 2 children with Asperger's, 11 and 13. I have constantly, throughout their school years, been in a struggle over the definition of appropriate training for my special ed teachers and general education teachers. What types of training, in your opinion, is appropriate for the special ed teacher, general ed teacher, and paraprofessionals that I have in place for my children?
Well, one of the problems I see generally in schools is they throw them into a lot of these very general information type seminars where it's, this is the diagnostic criteria of Asperger's, these are the statistics, this is the research. The training they get is far too informational. What you really want to advocate for is to have trainings come right to the school. People who can sit there and problem solve the unique situations of the student body of that school. And that's one of the things that I do in my area routinely. In fact, in a couple of days, I'm doing it for a very large school who wants to know how to help their Asperger's population, because they know the other trainings out there just don't do it because it doesn't talk to the specific child. It's pretty much like if you went and got a a seminar on women and women's issues, are you then going to be able to understand every single woman you come across? Absolutely not, because not all of them are the same. They are also individuals. So when you go to those generic seminars that talk about Asperger's in general, well, yeah, how does it help me with my child? My child has Asperger's, but also has his or her own interests, also has his or her own beliefs, and his or her own unique experiences. So it needs to be something that can be brought down to the level of the individual, and you can only really do that if you do smaller training, smaller in-services in the school. So I recommend that he find some kind of an expert. I mean, I can fly from state to state if needed, or find someone more local to just really get in there and get personal with the teachers, the staff, and the unique needs of their students.
Right, because when you individualize it, that's when you'll be able to come up with the practical tips and strategies to help support that student and the peers or the teachers that are with them.
Right, because that's why, and I don't know if this is a universal term, but in Illinois special ed, they call it the Individualized Education Plan, the IEP, and it's called individualized for a reason, because every child's unique set of strengths and challenges is particular to them. So you can't just say, okay, this is what we do for IEPs, and we're going to give it to every special needs child, and we're going to treat them just the same, and we're going to have happy results. Clearly, we know it doesn't work that way. So we need to have that specialized training.
Well, Brian, it's really funny because I'm sure that most of the parents who are listening to this will tell you right now that in all the states we have IEPs, but just because there's the word individualized in it doesn't mean that it actually happens. And that's what part of our fight is. And I think that when we have the title here, Moms Fighting Autism, it isn't that we're fighting autism, it's that we're fighting to have the things that we need to help our children who do have autism. How about another question now? Well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that one of my favorite things to do is teach parents how to advocate, because a lot of the IEPs that I see are frankly garbage. They're best used to cover the bottom of a bird's cage than they are to help guide the education of a child, because the goals are poorly defined. They're defined in such a way where they put all the responsibility on the child. Jimmy will do this, and Jimmy will do that, and so will observe how well Jimmy does it. There's very little in there in terms of how the staff will support them, how the staff is accountable to that child, and the imbalance in these goals, the lack of clarity. It's a recipe for failure. So I really love getting my hands into those and saying, this is what we're going to do to hold the school accountable, and also make them partners in this process, instead of it being all about the child doing everything and the school doing nothing.
That's right, and people feel more as if they're a part of the process if they do feel that they're accountable. Okay, so how about a question from Chris Nell from Woolwich, Pennsylvania. My 6-year-old son is having terrible difficulties keeping it together during school hours. He thrashes on the floor, kicks, hits, and slams things. We feel so frustrated because we can't seem to figure out what is causing these meltdowns and find a way for him to vent in an acceptable way. Thank you. These internet seminars are excellent.
Well, if he's thrashing about and he can't hold it together in the classroom setting, the one word to describe his experience is disorganization. Whatever's happening in that environment that is preventing him from feeling centered and feeling balanced, that's what the issue is. And the way you're going to get a handle on that is to understand not only his sensory issues. Is it sound? Is it touch? Is it smell? If it's all of them, find out how those things are being assaulted in the classroom. If he's sensitive to light, keep in mind you have fluorescent lights in classrooms and you have a lot of reflective surfaces. They have these high shine floors and these whiteboards. They're looking at white paper. They're looking at textbooks with white paper. So if he has light sensitivity, he can't get away from it. It's the same as being, poked in the leg with the knife. Okay, ignore it. I'm just going to keep poking you, but ignore it. And if he has sound sensitivities, anytime a desk moves and squeaks, anytime a sneaker hits the floor and squeaks, over and over and over all day long. And then that's just the sensory piece. Let's now move into the more cognitive area. Kids on the spectrum are unitaskers. They focus on one thing at a time. They're not particularly skilled at multitasking. doing many things at multiple times or processing multiple sources of information. When you are in a classroom, it is a multi-sensory environment. And I hear teachers brag about this. Well, we, accommodate all the different kind of learning styles. We have them do activities for kinesthetic, and we have, visuals for the more visual learners, and we speak for the auditory learners. Well, what happens if your child is a unitasker and you're bombarding them with all these different things and they have no idea what to pay attention to? And let's say they're an auditory learner. Well, they're trying to listen while simultaneously taking notes, while listening or watching the teacher move around the room, while watching what the teacher's writing on the board. You're requiring them to multitask when they really need a unitask. That in itself will drive a spectrum child nuts because they don't have an opportunity to focus, because they're constantly being pulled out of focus when they really want to concentrate. So when you learn more about how your child thinks, how they process, and you can usually get at that through their special interests. If they're more video games, they're much more visual. Two of my spectrum children love to listen to music, to their iPhones and iTunes, and it just so happens they're much more verbal, much more auditory learners. So when you see what they gravitate towards for pleasure, that gives you a sense of how they learn, how they interact with the environment. The more kinesthetic kids that like to do somersaults and roll around, they're going to learn more hands-on through their body. So being in the classroom and listening and watching stuff while they're fidgeting in their chair, the fidgeting says, I want to move. I want to get up and interact with my environment. I don't want to sit here and passively take things in visually and auditorily. It's not how I learn. So I hope that's not too much and gives kind of an overview of how to get a sense of where this child's coming from.
Oh, but it's important to be able to look at those different kinds of things to make a bit of an analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Here's one from Stacy Way, Winter Haven, Florida. I guess it's Stacy Way from Winter Haven, Florida. My son has HFA, high-functioning autism, and I was wondering, coming from a grown man, what was your biggest fear growing up, and what was your influence to do what you do now? And if I may ask one more, my son has a hard time focusing. You have to sit in the room during homework and constantly reminds what it is he needs to be doing. He's easily sidetracked. Same problem at school, not completing his assignment. Is there a medication that is safe, or is something else you would recommend? So that's two questions. So let's take the first one. What was your biggest fear growing up, and what was your influence to do what you do now? I guess that's two questions itself.